Officer Marcus Webb had been with the Georgia State Patrol for 11 years when he walked into a situation that would destroy his career, humiliate his department, and cost the state $18 million. He was 38 years old, experienced enough to understand a chain of evidence, mature enough to verify before acting, but apparently convinced that his assumptions about what a Supreme Court justice should look like were more reliable than the credentials in front of his face. One Thursday afternoon at Eternal Rest Memorial Gardens in Atlanta, he responded to a call from a funeral director who reported an unauthorized person disrupting a private service. The unauthorized person was Justice Elaine Crawford, a 28-year member of the Georgia Supreme Court, standing beside the casket of her 35-year-old son, Dr. Marcus Crawford, Jr., who died of a sudden cardiac event 6 days earlier. What Officer Webb did next, dismissing her judicial credentials as fake, ignoring the funeral director's correction, and arresting her in front of 200 mourners, including 3 sitting governors and 2 U.S. senators, would become a definitive case study of how racial bias operates even in the presence of overwhelming evidence. It would end Webb's career, trigger a federal civil rights investigation, and force Georgia to pay the largest wrongful arrest settlement in state history. A black woman in her early 60s, Justice Elaine Crawford stood in a black mourning dress and pearls beside her son's mahogany casket on a humid Thursday afternoon. Her judicial ID badge hung from a lanyard around her neck, visible to anyone who looked. No disturbance, no trespassing, no violation. Just a mother standing beside her son's body, moments before his burial. But Officer Webb saw her through a lens so warped by assumptions about race and authority that he couldn't process a black woman as a Supreme Court justice, even with her credentials literally hanging from her neck. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. Eternal Rest Memorial Gardens sits on a sprawling 40-acre property off Peachtree Road in northeast Atlanta. It's the kind of cemetery where Georgia's most prominent families have buried their dead for 150 years. Judges, senators, business leaders, civil rights pioneers. Marble headstones, manicured lawns, century-old oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The main chapel is a pristine white colonial revival building with towering columns and floor-to-ceiling windows that flood the interior with natural light. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday in September. The temperature hovered at 89 degrees. Humidity made the air feel thick and heavy. Inside the chapel, 200 people filled the pews. Family, friends, colleagues, dignitaries. 3 former Georgia governors sat in the 3rd row. 2 U.S. senators occupied the 5th. Atlanta's mayor sat near the front. Federal judges, state legislators, law professors, physicians, the kind of crowd that assembles when someone of consequence dies young. Dr. Marcus Crawford, Jr. had been a cardiologist at Emory University Hospital, published researcher, devoted father of 2. He'd collapsed during a morning run 6 days earlier. Sudden cardiac arrest at 35. No warning, no prior symptoms, just gone. His mother, Justice Elaine Crawford, had delivered the eulogy 20 minutes earlier. Her voice had been steady, controlled, devastated. She'd spoken about her son's brilliance, his kindness, his dedication to saving lives he couldn't save his own. The service had concluded. The pallbearers had carried the casket outside to the burial site under a white tent 50 yards from the chapel. Family members were gathering for the final farewell. The kind of moment where nothing dramatic should ever happen. Justice Elaine Crawford had served on the Georgia Supreme Court for 28 years. 28 years of writing opinions that shaped state law on everything from criminal sentencing reform to corporate liability to voting rights protections. She'd authored 340 majority opinions, 89 concurrences, and 47 dissents. Her colleagues, even those who disagreed with her judicial philosophy, called her brilliant. Legal scholars called her one of the most influential state Supreme Court justices in the country. Law students studied her opinions in constitutional law classes at universities from California to Massachusetts. She'd graduated summa cum laude from Spelman College in 1983, then earned her J.D. from Yale Law School in 1986, where she'd served as an editor on the Yale Law Journal and clerked for Judge A. Leon Higginbotham, Jr. on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. After her clerkship, She'd spent 8 years in private practice at King & Spalding in Atlanta, specializing in appellate litigation and civil rights law. She'd argued cases before the 11th Circuit, represented death row inmates pro bono, and won a landmark employment discrimination case that changed how Georgia courts applied Title VII. At 34, Governor Zell Miller appointed her to the Georgia Supreme Court, making her the youngest justice and the first black woman to serve on the state's highest court. She'd been confirmed unanimously. She'd been retained in every subsequent election by margins exceeding 70%. She'd received honorary degrees from 6 universities. The American Bar Association had given her its highest honor for judicial excellence. President Obama had considered her for the U.S. Supreme Court in 2010. At 62 years old, Justice Crawford was exactly where 3 decades of work had positioned her: respected, influential, and trusted with some of the most consequential legal questions facing Georgia. She'd sacrificed personal time, delayed retirement, and prioritized public service. She'd raised her son mostly alone after her husband died of cancer, when Marcus Jr. was 11. She'd attended his soccer games between oral arguments. She'd helped him with college applications, while writing opinions on death penalty cases. She'd watched him graduate from Morehouse, then medical school at Emory, then complete his cardiology fellowship. She'd been there when he got married, when both his daughters were born, and 6 days ago, she'd identified his body in the hospital where he'd worked. That Thursday, Justice Crawford had given the eulogy for her only child. She'd stood at the podium in the chapel and spoken for 12 minutes about the son she'd raised, the doctor he'd become, the father he was to his own children. Her voice had cracked twice. She'd paused to collect herself 3 times. Then she'd finished, walked down from the podium, and taken her seat in the front row. The service concluded at 2:40 p.m. The pallbearers carried Marcus Jr.'s casket out of the chapel toward the burial site. Family members followed. Justice Crawford walked beside the casket, one hand resting on the polished mahogany. She wore a simple black dress, pearls, low heels. Her judicial ID badge hung from a lanyard around her neck, a laminated card with her photo, name, title, and the gold seal of the Georgia Supreme Court. Not hidden in a purse or pocket, visible. She'd worn it intentionally, knowing she'd be in public, knowing her presence at a high-profile funeral might require identification. She looked like what she was, a grieving mother walking beside her son's casket. She'd spoken to no one except family. She'd caused no disturbance. She'd violated no protocol. But to the funeral director standing near the chapel entrance, Justice Elaine Crawford's presence at this funeral didn't make sense, and that funeral director decided to do something about it. David Kellerman was 52 years old. He'd been the director of operations at Eternal Rest Memorial Gardens for 14 years, managing everything from burial plots to staff scheduling to client relations. He was meticulous about protocol, obsessed with maintaining what he called the dignity and decorum of the property. He wanted Eternal Rest to be the premier cemetery in Atlanta, the place where prominent families felt comfortable burying their loved ones, a place where white families in particular felt their traditions were respected and protected. Over 14 years, Kellerman had developed a reputation. Staff members described him as particular, overly concerned about who belonged where, quick to question mourners who didn't fit his idea of the typical Eternal Rest client. He'd questioned a Hispanic family attending a service, asking to see their invitation. He'd asked a young black man in a suit for identification at a graveside burial, convinced he was crashing a funeral. He'd instructed security to monitor certain families more closely than others, families whose demographics didn't match the deceased's information in the computer system. 6 formal complaints had been filed against Kellerman over 9 years. A family whose daughter had married a black man reported that Kellerman questioned whether her husband belonged at the funeral. An Asian American family reported Kellerman asking if they were at the right service when they arrived for their mother's burial. A biracial family reported Kellerman repeatedly asking for identification from the black family members, while waving white family members through without question. Each complaint had been addressed with diversity training that Kellerman attended but never internalized. Management considered him valuable. He kept operations running smoothly. He managed a large staff effectively, and wealthy white families loved him. So the complaints were noted, filed, and essentially ignored. That Thursday afternoon, Kellerman had been monitoring the Crawford funeral from his office. High-profile service, prominent guests. He'd recognized the governors, the senators, the mayor. Everything had gone smoothly until the service ended and people began moving toward the burial site. That's when Kellerman noticed something that didn't fit. A black woman walking beside the casket with her hand resting on top. He checked the service information on his computer. The deceased was Dr. Marcus Crawford Jr., 35 years old, cardiologist, survived by his mother, Justice Elaine Crawford. Kellerman had met Justice Crawford exactly once, 10 days earlier, when she'd come to finalize burial arrangements. She'd been calm, professional, devastated, and white. At least that's what Kellerman remembered. Or maybe he'd just assumed. Or maybe he'd confused her with someone else. But in Kellerman's mind, the woman walking beside the casket couldn't be Justice Crawford. Justice Crawford was an important person, a Supreme Court justice. Important people in Georgia, in Kellerman's experience, were usually white. This woman was black. Therefore, this woman must be an imposter, or a mourner who'd gotten too close to the family, or someone trying to take advantage of a funeral to steal from expensive cars in the parking lot. Kellerman's mind created a narrative that made sense to him, a narrative built entirely on racial assumptions. He didn't check the woman's face against the photo in his office file. He didn't ask his staff if they'd verified her identity. He didn't consider that maybe, just maybe, his memory was wrong. He just picked up the phone and called the Georgia State Patrol dispatcher. He reported an unauthorized person disrupting a funeral. Someone who claimed to be family but couldn't be. Someone who needed to be removed before the burial began. Officer Marcus Webb was 38 years old. He'd been with the Georgia State Patrol for 11 years, mostly working highway patrol and special event security. He was experienced, trained in de-escalation, certified in crisis intervention. He'd received commendations for professional conduct, but he'd also compiled a less visible record. 9 complaints over 11 years. 3 involved accusations of profiling black drivers on Interstate 75 during what Webb called high-crime traffic stops. 2 involved excessive force allegations during arrests. Both cases settled quietly by the state with no admission of wrongdoing. 4 involved complaints about dismissive or disrespectful behavior toward black residents during routine interactions. Each complaint had been investigated. 3 were sustained, resulting in written reprimands and mandatory retraining. 6 were closed without findings. But the pattern was there. Webb had difficulty seeing black people as credible, as legitimate, as deserving of the same presumption of innocence he extended to white citizens. And despite 9 complaints in 11 years, he remained on full duty. Webb arrived at eternal rest at 2:45 p.m. He'd been patrolling nearby when the call came in. Unauthorized person at a funeral. Funeral director requesting removal. Simple enough. He pulled into the cemetery, parked near the chapel, and walked toward the burial site where people were gathering under a white tent. Kellerman met him halfway and pointed. That's her, the woman in black standing next to the casket. She's not supposed to be here. Webb's training should have kicked in. Verify the complaint. Ask questions. Speak to the subject calmly. Assess the situation before acting. But Webb looked at where Kellerman was pointing and saw a black woman standing close to a casket at a high-profile funeral. And in Webb's mind, shaped by years of assumptions he'd never examined, that had to be wrong. He walked directly toward Justice Crawford. Do you think funeral directors who make racially motivated 911 calls should face mandatory bias training and financial penalties? Drop your answer below. Justice Crawford was standing at the head of the casket, one hand resting on the smooth mahogany, when she became aware of movement behind her. She turned and saw a Georgia State Patrol officer approaching, his expression flat and professional, but his body language aggressive. Shoulders forward, steps quick and deliberate. Ma'am, you need to step away from the casket. Justice Crawford's face registered confusion before she could stop it. She glanced at the funeral director standing 10 feet away, then back at the officer. I'm his mother. The officer didn't soften. His eyes scanned her quickly. Her dress, her age, her race, and his expression hardened into something resembling certainty. The family is inside. Whoever you are, this is a private service. Crawford felt the first surge of disbelief mix with anger. Around her, mourners had stopped moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. Phones came out. "I am the family. This is my son." She gestured toward the casket. Her voice still controlled but taking on an edge. "The deceased's mother is Justice Elaine Crawford." "You're not Justice Crawford." Justice Crawford's breath caught. For a moment, she just stared at him. "I am Justice Elaine Crawford. This is my son's funeral." Webb's expression didn't change. His voice remained flat, dismissive. "Justice Crawford is white." The words hung in the humid air. Around them, the crowd had gone completely silent. 200 people watching. Recording. Justice Crawford felt her face flush with a combination of grief, rage, and something close to disbelief. "I'm a black woman. I've always been a black woman. And this is my son." She reached for the ID badge hanging from her neck and held it up. The laminated card with her photo, her name, her title, the gold seal of Georgia's highest court. Webb glanced at it. Barely. His eyes flicked to the badge for maybe 2 seconds, then back to her face. "I don't know who you are, but you need to leave now before this becomes a problem. This is where bias becomes impenetrable, where no amount of evidence can penetrate a conclusion someone's already reached." Webb looked at Justice Crawford and saw what he expected to see. A black woman who didn't belong at a prominent funeral. Her badge, her credentials, her grief, none of it registered. His mind had decided. His assumptions had calcified into certainty. And nothing she could say or show would change his perception, because the problem wasn't the evidence. The problem was his refusal to see her as legitimate. Justice Crawford's voice dropped into something colder, harder, more dangerous. "My son died 6 days ago. I buried my career for 30 years to serve this state. And you're telling me I can't attend his funeral?" Webb reached for his handcuffs. "Ma'am, turn around and place your hands behind your back." The crowd erupted. Voices rose in shock and protest. Someone shouted from the tent, "That's Justice Crawford." Another voice, "She's on the Supreme Court." A third, "What are you doing?" Webb ignored them. He stepped closer, handcuffs in hand. Justice Crawford looked at him with an expression of pure contempt mixed with devastating grief. "You're arresting me at my son's funeral." She held up her wrists, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I am complying under protest. My name is Justice Elaine Crawford. I serve on the Georgia Supreme Court. I am this man's mother. These are unlawful handcuffs. I am complying to prevent violence. I want every witness here to note that." The metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the cemetery. Webb gripped her wrists tighter than necessary. The metal bit into her skin. She winced but didn't cry out. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." A woman in the crowd was crying. An older man, one of the former governors, stepped forward. "Officer, you're making a serious mistake. That woman is Justice Elaine Crawford. I've known her for 20 years. Webb didn't respond. He guided, pushed, Justice Crawford toward his patrol car. She walked with her head high, handcuffs behind her back, past 200 stunned mourners, past her sons, colleagues from the hospital, past her son's widow, who stood frozen in shock, past the casket containing her son's body. Phones were everywhere now, dozens of cameras capturing every angle. The Georgia State Patrol officer, the handcuffs, the Supreme Court justice, the funeral, the casket 10 feet away. Justice Crawford looked back once as Webb opened the rear door of his patrol car. She looked at her son's casket under the white tent, at the burial site where he should be laid to rest in minutes, at the family and friends gathered to say goodbye. Then Officer Marcus Webb placed his hand on her head and pushed her into the back seat of his patrol car. Should officers who arrest public officials without verifying credentials face automatic termination? Let me know what you think. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Reeves arrived at Eternal Rest Memorial Gardens 11 minutes after Webb radioed in his arrest. She was a 24-year veteran of the Georgia State Patrol, the highest-ranking woman in the department, and someone who'd spent years managing situations where officers made catastrophic errors. She'd reviewed use-of-force incidents. She'd investigated complaints. She'd terminated officers whose judgment endangered both themselves and the public. But she'd never responded to anything quite like this. She pulled into the cemetery and immediately saw the crowd gathered near the burial site, saw Webb's patrol car, saw people pointing and shouting, heard someone yelling from inside the car. She approached quickly, her face already hardening into something between fury and dread. Webb stood beside his patrol car, defensive, arms crossed. Justice Crawford sat in the back seat, handcuffs still on, her face visible through the window. Composed but enraged. What happened here? Webb straightened. Funeral director called in an unauthorized person, disrupting a service. Subject refused to leave. Subject presented fake credentials claiming to be Justice Crawford. I placed her under arrest for criminal trespass and obstruction. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves stared at him. She looked at the crowd. Governors, senators, dignitaries, all staring at Webb with expressions ranging from shock to fury. She looked at the funeral director, who'd gone pale and was backing away slowly. She looked at the woman in the back seat. Did you verify her identity? Webb hesitated. She showed me a badge. Looked fake. Reeves opened the rear door. She looked at Justice Crawford's face, the calm, cold fury of a woman who'd spent 3 decades commanding courtrooms. Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Reeves. May I see your identification? Justice Crawford's voice was ice. My ID badge is around my neck. I showed it to your officer. He called it fake. My driver's license is in my purse, which your officer refused to let me retrieve, and I've been sitting in handcuffs for 10 minutes at my son's funeral. Reeves carefully reached for the ID badge hanging from Crawford's neck. She examined it. The photo, the name, the title, the seal. Then she pulled out her phone and opened the Georgia Supreme Court website. She pulled up Justice Crawford's official photo and bio. She compared the face in the photo to the face in front of her. They were identical. Reeves's expression went from dread to something colder. She walked back to Webb, her voice dropping to barely controlled rage. You arrested a sitting Supreme Court justice at her son's funeral after she showed you valid credentials. Webb's face drained of color. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. The funeral director said, I don't care what the funeral director said. You verify before you arrest. That's basic procedure. You look at the badge. You check the ID. You call it in. You don't handcuff a Supreme Court justice at her son's funeral because someone told you she doesn't look like she belongs. Reeves turned and walked back to the patrol car. She unlocked the handcuffs herself. Justice Crawford rubbed her wrists. Deep red marks were visible where the metal had dug in. Justice Crawford, on behalf of the Georgia State Patrol, I apologize. This is inexcusable. Completely inexcusable. Crawford stepped out of the car. She looked at Reeves, then at Webb, then at the crowd still gathered, still watching, still recording. I want my son buried. Then I want accountability. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves turned to Webb. Her voice carried across the cemetery, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Badge, weapon, and radio. Administrative leave effective immediately. You will not return to duty pending a full investigation and termination proceedings. Webb's hands shook as he unpinned his badge, unholstered his service weapon, and handed over his radio. For the first time, he seemed to understand what he'd done. Lieutenant Colonel, I was responding to a call. You arrested a Supreme Court justice for attending her son's funeral. Give me your credentials. Now, Webb handed them over. His 11-year career effectively ended in that moment. Reeves escorted Justice Crawford back toward the burial site. The crowd parted. Justice Crawford walked to her son's casket and placed both hands on the mahogany. She stood there for a long moment, her back straight, her head high. Then the burial began. Within 90 minutes, the videos had exploded across every major social media platform. Multiple angles from dozens of witnesses. Justice Elaine Crawford showing her credentials. Officer Webb dismissing them. The handcuffs. The perp walk. The Supreme Court justice pushed into a patrol car at her son's funeral. Supreme Court justice. Arrested at son's funeral for being black. Georgia officer arrests. Black judge at funeral calls her credentials fake. She showed her badge. He arrested her anyway, at her son's funeral. The outrage was seismic. The Georgia Bar Association issued a statement within 2 hours, calling the arrest unconscionable. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund demanded federal charges. 12 sitting federal judges released a joint statement condemning the arrest as a violation of judicial independence and civil rights. The governor of Georgia called Justice Crawford personally to apologize. The head of the Georgia State Patrol issued a public statement, calling Webb's actions indefensible and announcing an immediate investigation. David Kellerman, the funeral director who made the call, tried to explain himself to local media. "I thought there was a discrepancy. I was trying to maintain order." His statement was met with immediate backlash. Eternal Rest Memorial Gardens fired him within 36 hours. He was named as a defendant in Justice Crawford's lawsuit. His name became synonymous with racial profiling and death services. Officer Marcus Webb's life imploded. He was placed on immediate administrative leave. The Georgia State Patrol launched a comprehensive review of his complaint history. 9 complaints over 11 years, 3 sustained, all involving allegations of racial bias. Internal Affairs conducted interviews with every person Webb had arrested in the past 5 years. Patterns emerged. Black drivers stopped at higher rates. Black suspects treated more aggressively. Black victims given less credibility. The documentation was extensive. The pattern was undeniable. Webb released a brief statement through his attorney. "I made an error in judgment under difficult circumstances. I apologize to Justice Crawford and her family." The apology was universally rejected. Making an error is forgetting to file paperwork. Arresting a Supreme Court justice at her son's funeral is bias backed by a badge. Justice Crawford contacted civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump and a team of Georgia's most prominent civil rights lawyers. 3 weeks after the incident, they filed a federal lawsuit in the Northern District of Georgia. The complaint named Officer Marcus Webb, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Reeves for supervisory failure, Funeral Director David Kellerman, Eternal Rest Memorial Gardens, the Georgia State Patrol, and the state of Georgia. The claims were extensive and devastating: unlawful arrest without probable cause, false imprisonment during a funeral, violation of federal civil rights under 42 U.S.C., Paragraph of 1983, racial profiling and discrimination, violation of judicial independence, excessive use of force, handcuffs applied too tightly, unnecessary physical force, intentional infliction of emotional distress, arrested at her son's funeral, violation of First Amendment rights, retaliation for her judicial work on civil rights cases, failure to train and supervise officers with documented patterns of racial bias. The complaint included Webb's complete record: 9 complaints in 11 years, 3 sustained, 6 dismissed without adequate investigation, multiple incidents of profiling, multiple allegations of excessive force, all documented, all filed, all essentially ignored until Webb arrested someone with the power and credentials to fight back. The complaint included Kellerman's complaint history: 6 incidents over 9 years, all involving racial bias, all dismissed with diversity training that changed nothing. The complaint included one additional fact: Justice Crawford had authored 14 majority opinions over 28 years involving excessive force, racial profiling, and qualified immunity. She'd ruled against police officers who violated civil rights. She'd dissented when her colleagues gave law enforcement too much deference. She'd written opinions limiting qualified immunity protections. And now she'd been arrested at her son's funeral by an officer who demonstrated a pattern of the exact behavior she'd spent 3 decades trying to curtail through judicial opinions. The Georgia Attorney General's office reviewed the evidence, the videos from multiple angles, the witness statements from governors, senators, federal judges. Justice Crawford's credentials: undeniably real. Webb's complaint history: undeniably extensive. Kellerman's pattern of bias: undeniably documented. The funeral: undeniably disrupted. The handcuffs: undeniably tight. The humiliation: undeniably public. The grief: undeniably violated. The state's attorneys reached a conclusion: completely indefensible. No viable defense. No possible justification. Settle immediately and hope the damage can be contained. Georgia settled 14 months after the incident. The settlement amount was staggering: $18 million paid to Justice Elaine Crawford, the largest wrongful arrest settlement in Georgia history. Eternal Rest Memorial Gardens contributed an additional $500,000 from their liability insurance. Officer Marcus Webb was terminated 6 weeks after the arrest. The termination letter was final, comprehensive, and devastating. Officer Marcus Webb arrested a sitting Georgia Supreme Court justice without probable cause, refused to verify legitimate judicial credentials, engaged in racial profiling during a funeral service, and demonstrated a pattern of discriminatory policing documented across 9 complaints over 11 years. Despite multiple training interventions and sustained findings, Officer Webb continued to demonstrate behavior incompatible with law enforcement service. His employment is terminated immediately and permanently. Webb's name was entered into the National Decertification Index. His law enforcement career was over at 38 years old. His pension was revoked. His appeals were denied. He released no further statements. David Kellerman faced his own consequences. Fired from eternal rest. Named in the lawsuit. His name permanently associated with one of the most egregious examples of racial profiling in funeral services. He issued one final statement. I let my assumptions override reality. I'm sorry, but apologies don't undo trauma. Should law enforcement officers who arrest public officials face federal charges? Drop your answer. Justice Elaine Crawford testified before a joint session of the Georgia legislature 8 months after the incident. She'd been invited to speak about judicial independence and racial bias in law enforcement. Her testimony was broadcast live. The chamber was packed. She stood at the podium in a dark blue suit, her face composed, but her voice carrying the weight of everything she'd experienced. I am Justice Elaine Crawford. I have served on the Georgia Supreme Court for 28 years. I've authored 340 majority opinions. I've been retained in 4 elections by an average margin of 72%. I have dedicated my adult life to this state's legal system. She paused, letting that sink in. On September 14th, I stood beside my son's casket at his funeral. I wore my judicial ID badge around my neck. It was visible. I showed it to Officer Marcus Webb when he approached me. I identified myself clearly, repeatedly. I am Justice Elaine Crawford. This is my son's funeral. I am his mother. Another pause, longer this time. Officer Webb looked at my credentials and called them fake. He arrested me. He handcuffed me. He pushed me into a patrol car. He did this in front of 200 witnesses, including 3 former governors of this state. He did this at my son's funeral. He did this because when he looked at me, he saw a black woman, and his bias told him that a black woman could not be a Supreme Court justice. Her voice strengthened, took on an edge. Officer Webb had 9 complaints in 11 years. 9. 3 of them sustained. Multiple allegations of racial profiling. Multiple allegations of excessive force. The pattern was documented. The pattern was clear. But Officer Webb remained on full duty until he arrested someone with the power to fight back. She looked directly at the legislators. 9 complaints in 11 years. That's not bad luck. That's not isolated incidents. That's a pattern. And that pattern was allowed to continue until it targeted a Supreme Court justice at her son's funeral. Her voice dropped, became quieter but more intense. The state of Georgia paid $18 million to settle my lawsuit. That's accountability. That's recognition of harm. But that money doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't undo being handcuffed at my son's funeral. It doesn't undo the humiliation of being arrested in front of my family and colleagues. It doesn't restore the 15 minutes I lost with my son before he was buried. It doesn't erase the message Officer Webb sent, that even as a Supreme Court justice, I can be treated as a criminal for being black in a space where someone decided I didn't belong. She straightened, her voice now carrying across the chamber with judicial authority. If this can happen to me, with my credentials, with my position, with my 3 decades of service to this state, what happens to everyone else? What happens to the black mother at her daughter's graduation? The black man at his own house? The black professional at their own workplace? If a Supreme Court justice can be arrested at her son's funeral, who is safe? The chamber was completely silent. You need to answer that question. Because the system that kept Officer Webb on duty, despite 9 complaints, is the same system that allows this to happen every day to people without badges, without titles, without the resources to fight back. And until you fix that system, $18 million settlements are just the cost of doing business, while bias operates with a badge. She gathered her notes and walked from the podium. The silence lasted another 10 seconds before applause erupted. Should police officers face automatic termination after 3 sustained complaints? Drop your answer below. This wasn't just about one afternoon at one funeral. This was about a Georgia State Patrol that let Marcus Webb accumulate 9 complaints over 11 years, without removing him from duty. 9 complaints, 3 sustained, multiple allegations of racial bias, multiple allegations of excessive force. And the response every time was the same: written reprimand, diversity training, back on patrol. Webb's record told a story his supervisors ignored. A black driver stopped for a minor traffic violation and searched without consent. Complaint filed. A black teenager questioned aggressively during a wellness check. Complaint filed. A black woman asked for identification while walking in her own neighborhood. Complaint filed. Every complaint followed the same pattern. Webb saw black people as suspicious, as criminal, as people who needed to prove they belonged. And every time, the system responded with training that never changed his behavior. The pattern was documented. The pattern was clear. But Georgia treated each complaint in isolation, never connecting them, never acknowledging that 9 complaints over 11 years meant Webb shouldn't be carrying a badge. Webb's career is over. That's justice. Georgia paid $18 million. That's accountability. David Kellerman was fired and publicly shamed. That's consequences. But money and terminations don't undo the trauma of being arrested at your child's funeral. They don't restore the dignity of being handcuffed in front of your family. They don't erase the message that even a Supreme Court justice can be treated as a criminal for being black. The real question is, what changes now? Does Georgia finally remove officers after 3 sustained complaints instead of 9? Do other states adopt automatic termination policies for patterns of racial bias? Do funeral homes train directors to recognize their assumptions before calling 911? Do we finally acknowledge that making someone uncomfortable often just means existing, while black in a space where someone decided you don't belong? Because if we don't fix the system that kept Webb on patrol, despite 9 complaints, if we don't address the culture that trained Kellerman to see black mourners as suspicious, then we're just waiting for the next officer, the next funeral director, the next victim, the next viral video, the next multi-million-dollar settlement that could have been prevented with accountability at Complaint 3. Comment if you believe this should be law. Law enforcement officers who accumulate 3 sustained complaints for racial bias or excessive force face automatic termination and decertification. And if you think these stories need to be told, if you believe accountability starts with awareness and change starts with pressure, then hit that subscribe button. We're not stopping. We're going to keep exposing these patterns. We're going to keep demanding that police departments connect the dots before an officer arrests a Supreme Court justice at her son's funeral. We're going to keep fighting for the mothers, the mourners, the professionals, the ordinary people who deserve to grieve without being criminalized. This isn't just about one officer, one funeral director, or one justice. It's about all of us and the world we're willing to tolerate. A world where 9 complaints means nothing until someone with power fights back. A world where credentials don't matter if your skin color contradicts someone's assumptions. A world where even burying your child can be interrupted by bias backed by a badge. Justice Crawford got her $18 million. Officer Webb lost his career. David Kellerman lost his job. But the real measure of justice isn't what happened after the arrest. It's whether we fix the system before the next one. Because there will be a next one. There always is. Unless we decide that 9 complaints is 8 too many. That pattern recognition matters more than qualified immunity. That accountability happens at Complaint 3, not after a Supreme Court justice gets arrested at a funeral. The videos are everywhere. The settlement is public record. The pattern is documented. The question is whether anyone with the power to change things is actually watching.